The pill was smaller than a molar, pale yellow, tasted like nothing, which Sarah said was the worst part. She'd expected something, a little bitterness, a chemical edge to mark the moment her consciousness punched a hole through time. Instead, it dissolved on the tongue like a communion wafer, and then the world went sideways. She came back to herself on the cold floor of the Meridian's engine compartment, 26 hours in her own future, her hands already doing something with the plasma coupler she didn't remember deciding to do. The body always knew before the mind caught up. That was Rule 1. Rule 1, trust the hands. Rule 2, don't look for yourself. Rule 3, get out in 60 minutes. Because after 60 minutes, something in the brain started pulling apart at the seams. Not metaphorically, not poetically, actually pulling apart, synaptic threading, unraveling like badly spliced wire. They'd lost Cho that way, 3 months before first contact. Back when first contact was still something that happened to other people, in the news, on the far end of someone else's solar system. Now it happened in your kitchen, on the highway, in the humming dark of a stolen alien cargo hauler idling 300 kilometers above what used to be Montreal. Sarah Vasquez had 4 rules, a 60-minute clock, and a team she'd assembled from the wreckage of a civilization that had been, until 8 months ago, blissfully ignorant of its own smallness. She had 26 hours of future knowledge crammed behind her eyes like a fist behind glass, and she had a job to do. The Venkarath did not think of themselves as conquerors. This was the part that galled her, had galled her since the first transmission, since the linguists cracked the root grammar of the signal and realized the Venkarath weren't issuing demands but processing a transaction. Earth had resources. The Venkarath required them. The exchange rate was non-negotiable. There was a schedule. There had always been a schedule. They seemed genuinely puzzled that humanity hadn't received the itinerary. Their ships were vast and architectural, grown rather than built, their hulls ridged and pale as old bone. They moved through the atmosphere like a second sky descending, 7 of them in geostationary positions over the major resource sites. The one above the Canadian Shield was called, in their own notation, Meridian Extraction Vessel 4. Humans had started calling it the Bone Palace. The Venkarath did not keep prisoners. They kept inventory. Sarah had learned this when they'd taken her sister. That was 8 months ago, before the Z compound. Before she'd found Lee's old files in the ruins of a research collective in what used to be Burlington, before she'd synthesized the compound herself from a recipe scrawled in the margins of a dead man's notebook, before she'd understood what Lee had discovered 3 years earlier, that the drug didn't just move your mind forward through time, it moved your mind forward through your own timeline. Meaning, if you already knew how to do something in the future, if you'd already solved the problem the moment the compound hit your bloodstream, you woke up doing it. You couldn't win a fight you hadn't already won, but you could find out if you'd won it, and then you could work backwards from that. Rule 4. The future is a draft. You can edit it, but you only get one draft. The team had no formal name. Sarah had suggested calling themselves something once in an early meeting in a church basement in upstate New York, and Marcus had looked at her over the rim of his flask and said, "Naming things makes them easier to lose," and nobody had disagreed. There were 5 of them. Marcus Osai, 41, former structural engineer, a man who communicated primarily in silences of varying lengths, and who could read the load-bearing mathematics of any structure, alien or human, by walking through it once. He'd survived the first sweep of the Canadian Shield by crawling under a collapsed overpass and staying there for 11 days. He had a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw that he never explained, and they never asked. Priya Sunder, 28, neurochemist, the one who'd actually stabilized the Z compound after Sarah's first 3 batches had given 2 volunteers 20-minute seizures, and one of them a persistent conviction that he was living his life in reverse. Priya was the reason any of them were still alive. She was also the reason they had rules 2 and 3, having personally documented what happened to a human brain that violated them. She kept the documentation on a battered tablet she never let anyone else read. Denny Falcao, 35, former competitive freediver, the only person Sarah had ever met who could slow his heart rate to 18 beats per minute on command. This made him the natural choice for the physical runs, the portions of a job that required actual presence inside the Venkarath vessels, where the air was wrong and the geometry of the corridors did something unsettling to human equilibrium. Denny walked those corridors like he was underwater, conserving, reading the pressure, finding the current, and then there was KL. Kael didn't have a last name, or didn't volunteer one. He was 23, a data analyst by training, a thief by necessity, and the fastest reader of Venkarath command notation that any human alive had managed to become. He'd spent 4 months alone after the initial incursions, sitting in an abandoned university library with a collection of signal intercepts and a cracked translation matrix that Priya called barely functional and Kael called enough. He had a habit of laughing quietly to himself when he was scared, and of going absolutely still and silent when he was working, and of looking at Sarah sometimes like she was a problem he was still trying to solve. Sarah was 33. She'd been a logistics analyst for a shipping company, which meant she understood, at a cellular level, how large moving things transported other things from one place to another, what was inside them, how the contents were tracked, and how you got something out of a system it wasn't supposed to leave. The Venkarath were, in her assessment, the largest logistics operation she had ever encountered. She was going to rob them. The job was this. The Bone Palace maintained a manifest database, a running inventory of every piece of biological material it had processed from the Canadian shield extraction. This included, according to a Venkarath command fragment Kael had translated 6 weeks ago, while laughing softly to himself in the dark, living specimens held in stasis for what the manifest called efficiency evaluation, meaning they hadn't been processed yet, meaning they were still there. Sarah needed the location codes for the stasis chambers. She needed the access protocol for the extraction bay on Deck 7. She needed the 26-second window that Venkarath security cycling created between patrol routes on that deck, a window she only knew about because she'd taken the Z compound 2 weeks ago and sent her future self to find it. Her future self had come back with bruised knuckles, a broken collarbone, and a set of location codes scratched into the underside of her own wrist in her own handwriting. She hadn't asked her future self what happened to her collarbone. She'd just said it. Rule 4. The insertion had gone cleanly, which Denny said was the worst sign. Clean insertions, he said, adjusting the rebreather over his face, his voice already taking on that underwater calm, are how the universe lulls you. The universe is not conscious, Priya said, checking the timer on her wrist. 53 minutes remaining, I know, but it acts like it is. The engine compartment of the Bone Palace was as large as a cathedral and smelled of something between ozone and copper and something organic that none of them had a word for. The walls were grown, not built, ribbed with structures that might have been structural supports or might have been something else. Bioluminescence pulsed in slow rhythms along the upper vaults. The Venkarath didn't use electric light. Their ships breathed. Sarah had landed them in a maintenance shaft 14 meters aft of the main engine assembly, a route her future self had identified as unmonitored during the security cycling window. The ship they'd come in was a stolen Venkarath supply drone, a vehicle roughly the size of a school bus, which Marcus had reprogrammed to masquerade as a routine maintenance unit. The reprogramming had taken him 11 days. He'd done it without sleep for the last 4, which Sarah had noticed and not commented on, because she recognized the look. She wore it herself, those last days before a job, when the alternative to working was thinking. They moved in single file through the maintenance shaft, Denny leading, his heart already at 22 beats per minute and falling. The alien geometry pressed around them. The corridors weren't quite round and weren't quite square. They tapered in ways that suggested something other than human architecture logic, a design sense that optimized for something Sarah couldn't name. Not efficiency, not aesthetics, something between them. Kael was third in line, directly ahead of Sarah, and she watched his left hand. He had a habit of touching his fingers together when he was translating in his head, thumb to index, thumb to middle, thumb to ring, running through the notation the way some people hummed. He was doing it now. Problem? She murmured. No, just making sure. Of what? That the codes are still the codes. He glanced back at her, briefly. His face in the bioluminescent glow was all shadow and pale light. The Venkarath update their access protocols every 36 hours. We're inside the window. But barely. How barely? 11 minutes. He paused. The codes will still work for 11 minutes. She absorbed this. Then we're moving faster. The stasis bay on Deck 7 was not what any of them had expected, which meant it was exactly what Sarah had expected, because she had learned by now that expectations were just the shapes you filled with dread before reality replaced them with something worse. The bay was vast. It was cold in the way that old churches are cold. Not the cold of absent heat, but the cold of actively maintained stillness, of something preserved against change. The stasis units were arranged in rows that curved upward along both walls and arched across the ceiling. Each unit a pale oblong housing, roughly coffin-shaped, sealed with a membrane rather than a door. Hundreds of them, possibly more than 100. Priya made a sound that wasn't a word. Marcus didn't make any sound at all. Denny had already gone still in the doorway, the way he went still when he was reading the room. Reading the pressure, finding the current. His eyes moved in slow sweeps. Cale stepped to the nearest terminal, his hands already moving, and Sarah stood at his back and watched the corridor behind them and thought of her sister. Maya, who was 31 and had been a pediatric nurse, and who had been standing in the street outside her apartment building when the first sweep came, and whom Sarah had spent 8 months trying to unfold from the Venkarath logistics chain, working backwards through their notation like a woman, unraveling a sweater one thread at a time. "I have the manifest," Cale said quietly. Sarah didn't turn around. "Alive?" A half-second pause. The worst half-second she'd ever lived in. 117 viable stasis units, Cale said. All living. Another pause, shorter. "She's in Unit 43. Sarah exhaled something that had been lodged behind her sternum for 8 months. "Okay," she said. "How long to open them?" "Opening them isn't the problem." Cale's voice had gone careful in a way she'd learned to pay attention to. "Moving them is. We can carry, what, 4? 6 at the outside with the drone bay." 17, Marcus said. They all looked at him. "The maintenance drone is rated for a 1,200-kilo payload," he said. 17 adult humans. Average weight, seated configuration. "I've been thinking about the math." He said it the way you'd say you'd been thinking about what to have for dinner. The scar along his jaw caught the bioluminescent glow. "We came for 1, Priya said. "I know what we came for." Silence. Sarah's timer said 39 minutes. The corridor behind them said nothing. The stasis units pulsed with a slow, organic light, 117 of them, and Sarah thought, this is what the future looks like when you've already seen it. This is the moment the draft gets hard to edit. 32 minutes, she said. "We take 17. Cale picks them by medical priority, anyone showing signs of system stress in the manifest data. Maya is one of the 17. Marcus calculates the load. Priya checks the membrane seals. Denny watches the corridor. We move." Nobody argued. This was the thing about the team, the thing she'd never been able to fully name. They didn't argue at the threshold of hard decisions. They'd already argued everything, beforehand, in basements and abandoned kitchens, over maps and signal intercepts and cold coffee. By the time they were in the field, the argument was over. What was left was the work. She let herself look at the rows of stasis units for exactly 3 seconds. One for Maya, one for the 116 others, one for herself. And then she turned to the corridor and kept watch, and they started. The first complication came at minute 41. Venkarath patrol units moved in pairs and were, by human standards, terrifyingly fast. Not because they were built for speed, but because they operated on a different reaction time architecture. Their threat processing distributed across a networked cluster, rather than centralized in a single brain. By the time one unit in a pair registered a threat and began formulating a response, the other had already responded. They were a 2-part system that functioned as one organism. Sarah had known this in the abstract. She'd read Cale's translated reports. She'd thought she understood it. Understanding it and seeing it at the end of a corridor at 4 in the morning, with 14 stasis units loaded and 3 still to go, and the alarm tone they'd been praying against now vibrating in the alien air like a second heartbeat. These were, she discovered, different things. Denny was already moving. He didn't run. Running in alien corridors at low gravity differentials was tactically catastrophic. She knew this, he knew this, they'd talked about it. He moved the way he moved underwater, in controlled bursts and angles, and he hit the first patrol unit in the joint between its primary appendages, the point Priya had identified, months ago, from anatomical scans, as the Venkarath equivalent of a pressure point or something close to one, and the unit folded with a sound like a cable snapping under tension. The second unit turned on a vector that should have given it a clear line to Denny, and then Marcus stepped out of the maintenance alcove and hit it with a structural support bar he'd been carrying since Deck 4, and the unit went down differently. Not folding, but dropping, the way heavy things drop when the weight stops being managed. Marcus stood over it for a moment, the bar in his hand, the scar on his jaw in pale light. "I've been thinking about this too," he said to no one in particular. 3 minutes, Priya said. They got the last 3 units. The run back to the maintenance shaft was not clean. Sarah had known it wouldn't be. Her future self had told her that, in the way future selves told you things, which was in the evidence they left behind. The bruised knuckles and the broken collarbone, and the look on her own face that she'd spent 2 weeks trying not to interpret. She'd known there would be a chase. She'd known they'd make it, because otherwise there would have been no future self to send the message. But knowing didn't make the chase less real. The Venkarath alarm system, once triggered, didn't broadcast in frequencies humans could comfortably hear. It operated in a range that sat just below conscious perception and settled into the base of the skull as a low, continuous vibration that made thinking feel like trying to hold water in your hands. Sarah ran and thought through the vibration and pushed the stasis carts and thought, 17. We have 17, she thought. Maya is one of them, she thought. The draft is almost final. Kale was ahead of her, the stasis carts slaved to a remote he'd pulled from the command terminal, moving in a chain. Priya was counting aloud in a voice too quiet to hear but visible in the movement of her lips. Denny was behind them all, watching their tail, his heart somewhere around 14 beats per minute. The pursuit was 3 units, then 5. They moved in the distributed, networked way she now recognized as their coordination pattern, and she understood, in a sudden, visceral, entirely unwelcome way, why humanity had lost the first 8 months of contact so badly. They weren't dealing with adversaries. They were dealing with a system. Junction in 40 meters, Marcus said. He was reading the corridor architecture in real time, the way he read everything. The way someone who spent 11 days under a collapsed overpass learned to read load and stress and the geometry of survival. Left fork opens back toward extraction. Right fork is a maintenance dead end. We need the left fork? Sarah said. Yes, and they're between us and it, yes. 5 seconds. The vibration in the base of her skull. The stasis chain rumbling on the alien floor. Denny still counting heartbeats somewhere in the low teens. Sarah thought, I've already solved this. My future self solved this. The broken collarbone, the bruised knuckles, the look on my own face that I've been avoiding understanding for 2 weeks. She thought, the human solution isn't the fastest one or the strongest one, it's the one nobody expected. Marcus, she said, can you make the right fork look load-stressed? From here? He looked at her, a beat. You want me to fake a structural failure. I want you to make 5 networked processing units divert to assess a structural anomaly while we take the left fork. Another beat. She could see him running the math, the actual math, the stresses and loads and material tolerances of a corridor built by alien architects who'd never met a human engineer. 50-50, he said. I'll take it. He handed her the structural bar, and she held it while he took 3 precise steps to the right fork junction and did something to the wall with his bare hands that she couldn't fully follow. Pressing, testing, finding some load point she couldn't see. And then there was a sound like a groan moving through the material of the corridor itself, deep and structural, and the bioluminescence along the right fork flickered. The 5 pursuit units stopped. In the Venkarath patrol logic, a structural anomaly in a ship of this size represented a threat vector that outranked a maintenance-level incursion. She'd known this because Kale had translated it from a command protocol document 3 weeks ago, sitting in a church basement, his fingers running thumb to index, thumb to middle, and she'd thought, there, that's the edge. The units turned toward the right fork. Sarah and her team took the left. The drone bay was exactly where the future had said it would be. The stolen supply drone sat where they'd left it, and Marcus loaded the stasis units with a focused economy of movement, counting weights and angles, muttering math to himself, while Priya checked each unit's membrane integrity, and Kale worked the dock release from the terminal. Denny stood at the bay entrance and said nothing. Sarah stood next to him. The alarm tone still pulsed in the walls. Somewhere in the ship, 5 patrol units were assessing a structural anomaly that would eventually reveal itself as nothing, at which point the patrol would reorient. They had maybe 4 minutes. You know what I keep thinking about, Denny said, not looking at her. No, the rules. He paused. Rule 2 is don't look for yourself. I've thought about that a lot, about what it means that we made a rule specifically about that. Sarah watched the corridor. It means it's a temptation, right? It means the hardest thing, when you're in the future, isn't the mission. It's not looking yourself in the face and trying to get information you're not supposed to have yet. He glanced at her sideways. You looked. She didn't deny it. I needed to know if I'd made it. Did it help? She thought about the look on her own future face, the specific quality of it. Not triumphant, not broken, but weathered, the way a thing looks after it's been through weather and come out the other side still standing. Yes, she said. It helped. All aboard, Marcus said from the drone. They were 600 meters from the Bone Palace when the second complication arrived. The Venkarath had not, it turned out, sent 5 units to the structural anomaly. They'd sent 3. The other 2 had continued the pursuit on a secondary vector, threading through a maintenance corridor that ran parallel to the extraction bay and emerged with the terrible elegance of a network system operating without ego or hesitation, directly in the path of the drone's exit route. The drone was large and slow and not built for combat, neither was Sarah. The first unit came through the bay membrane as Marcus was still calculating exit trajectories, and it came fast, that distributed reaction time speed that still made her stomach drop, still made her human nervous system register something close to despair. And Cale was the one who moved. He moved badly. He moved like someone who was not Denny, who had not spent his life training his body for moments like this. He moved like a man who had spent 4 months alone in a library with a stack of alien signal intercepts, which is to say he moved like someone who had nothing to lose and had thought very carefully about what he would do with that condition. He got between the unit and the drone. He did something with his hands that was more mathematics than combat, pressing against the same joint Denny had found, but coming at it from a different angle, like he'd read the anatomy diagram and extrapolated. And the unit's forward momentum broke wrong, sending it into the bay wall instead of through Kyle. The second unit came in lower, and Denny was there, already, because of course he was. 23 seconds. 2 units on the floor. Cale with a dislocated shoulder, pressing himself against the wall, and breathing in the controlled way he'd learned from Denny, slow and deliberate, in through the nose and out through something that wasn't quite a wince. "I'm fine," he said before anyone asked. "You're not fine," Priya said. "Your shoulder is. I'm fine enough." He pulled himself toward the drone. "Let's go." They went. The atmosphere above the Bone Palace was a strange kind of beautiful. Sarah had noticed this before, the way the ship's mass affected the light, bending it slightly, the result being a halo effect around the vessel's upper ridges that she'd heard soldiers describe as eerie and photographers describe as extraordinary, and herself describe as neither, because she'd spent 8 months looking at it as an obstacle rather than a sight. Tonight, climbing away from it in a stolen drone with 17 living human beings in a cargo bay, she let herself look. She let herself look for 30 seconds. This was more than she'd allowed herself in 8 months. It felt like a small extravagance. It felt like something she'd earned with the compound and the rules and the bruised knuckles and the broken collarbone and the 4 years before all of it, the years she'd spent in ordinary life, doing ordinary work, not knowing what she was capable of until the universe arranged the circumstances to find out. Priya was in the back with the stasis units, monitoring the membrane integrity, documenting vitals on her battered tablet. Marcus was running the navigation calculations with the calm focus of a man who had been doing difficult math for 8 months and had decided somewhere along the way that the difficulty was not a bug but the whole point. Denny was quiet in the co-pilot seat, his heartbeat already climbing back towards something human, the underwater calm receding. Cale was beside her. His shoulder was set. Priya had done it with a practiced efficiency that suggested it wasn't the first time, and he was running the translation, still, thumb to index, thumb to middle, reading the Venkarath command traffic on a small screen and filtering for anything that suggested pursuit. "They're not coming after us," he said. Sarah frowned. "Why not?" "Because." He stopped. "Read something." The quiet laugh, brief and low, the one he made when he was scared. "Then, because they've logged this as a logistics anomaly, a discrepancy in the inventory manifest." He looked at her, something complicated in his face. "They're not treating it as a raid. They're treating it as a clerical error. A clerical error. 17 human beings in a Venkarath logistics system that operated at a scale so vast it could only process the loss as an administrative problem to be corrected through future scheduling. Not a theft, not a victory, a rounding error." Sarah sat with this for a moment, then she thought, 17. She thought Maya is one of them. She thought, this is what it looks like to win a fight the enemy doesn't know they're in. "Add it to the pattern," she said. Cale nodded slowly. "Yeah." The stasis units came online one by one, in a process that Priya managed with the focused care of someone who understood. At a molecular level, exactly what was happening inside each sealed housing. The slow rewarming, the neurochemical recalibration, the long, careful climb back to conscious function. It took 40 minutes per unit. They had 17 units. They were 12 hours from the safe house when the first person woke up. Not Maya. A man named Dev, 44, who'd been an electrician in Montreal before the sweep. He came back to awareness gradually, and then all at once, the way sleepers do, and his first act upon returning to consciousness was to look around the cargo bay of a stolen alien drone with 17 people in various stages of stasis revival and say, with complete composure, "Is it over?" "No," Priya told him gently, "but the worst part might be." Dev considered this. "Do you have water?" They had water. They had ration packs. They had, in the forward compartment, a flask of something Marcus had been carrying since the church basement in upstate New York, the contents of which he had never specified and never offered, until tonight, when he appeared in the cargo bay hatchway and held it out without a word. Dev took it, drank, made a face. "What is that?" "I don't know," Marcus said. "I found it." Dev handed it back. "It's terrible." "Yes." Marcus drank, passed it to Priya. "Everything worth having is." Maya woke up at hour 7. Sarah was there when she did. She'd been there for most of the 6 hours preceding it, sitting on the cargo bay floor with her back against the wall, running through the next job in her head. Because there was always a next job. There were 117 units in that bay, and they'd taken 17, and the math didn't stop being the math just because the math hurt. And when Maya's unit membrane began to cycle through the revival sequence, Sarah put the next job aside and sat forward and waited. Maya's eyes opened. Dark brown, the same as Sarah's. Same jaw, same collarbone. She looked at her sister for a long moment, the recalibration happening behind her eyes, the slow climb back. "You're a mess," Maya said. Sarah laughed. The laugh came out wrong, broken at the edges, rougher than she intended. But it came out, and that was enough. "You were in stasis for 8 months, Sarah said. "You look like you've been awake for 8 months. Close." Maya tried to sit up and didn't quite make it, and Sarah caught her, and they stayed like that for a while, in the cargo bay of a stolen drone above an alien-occupied planet, while 17 people climbed back to themselves in the dim organic light. "How bad is it?" Maya asked. "Bad. How bad?" Sarah thought about how to answer this. She thought about the Bone Palace and its 100 surviving stasis units. She thought about 6 other Bone Palaces in geostationary orbit. She thought about the Venkarath logistics system and its indifference in scale, and its complete failure to imagine that something as small and badly organized as a human team, with a stolen drug and a set of rules, could reach into it and pull things out. She thought about the clerical error. "They don't think we're a threat yet," Sarah said. "They think we're a rounding error." Maya was quiet for a moment. "Is that good?" "It's the best news we have." Sarah looked at her sister. "Because they're going to keep thinking that for as long as they can't imagine what we're capable of. And the thing about the Venkarath, the thing Kale keeps saying, the thing I keep not wanting to hear, is that their imagination is a closed system. It's networked, distributed. It doesn't have room for things it hasn't already categorized. And we're uncategorizable." "We're uncategorizable," Sarah said. "Stubborn, badly organized, sleep-deprived, and uncategorizable." Maya leaned her head against Sarah's shoulder. Outside the drone's viewports, the atmosphere curved away in every direction, pale and vast and indifferent in theirs. "What's the next job?" Maya asked. Sarah had been thinking about it for 6 hours. She'd been thinking about it, in one form or another, for 8 months. She thought about a protocol document Kale had translated last month, a scheduling manifest that referenced something the Venkarath notation called, and this was Kale's translation, his best approximation, primary allocation terminus. The central manifest, the master database, the accounting system that held, somewhere in its alien architecture, the records of every human being the Venkarath had processed. If you could get into the central manifest, you could find everyone. If you could find everyone, you could run the Z compound forward and see if they were findable. If they were findable, you could build a plan. You couldn't win a fight you hadn't already won. But you could find out if you'd won it, and then you could work backwards from there. "I'll tell you in the morning," Sarah said. Behind them, in row 3, Unit 9, another stasis membrane began its revival cycle, someone climbing back from a long way down. Sarah watched the membrane pulse and breathe and glow, and she thought, one more, and then one more after that, and then we figure out the next part. Rule 1, trust the hands. They always knew before the mind caught up.